So by example, I want to introduce to you an idea of even and odd trig functions and what those mean. So let's just look at an example of something I've drawn here right now. Notice that I have my best attempt at a unit circle, and I have some point P in the first quadrant and some Q in the fourth quadrant. Well, when I look at, for example, their values, what can you tell me about their values of X at P and at Q? Well, their values of X are the same. They both line up right there. So because of that, this tells me then that functions like the cosine and the secant are what we call even functions. Conversely, we also have some functions that are odd: sine, cosecant, tangent, and cotangent. What do you notice, for example, on the sine of these particular values? Well, the sine of negative t produces a value of a negative, as opposed to the sine of positive t is a positive. So those are where we get alternating signs, or by definition, we have what we call an odd function. So it's good for us to know that our trig functions, we have two even functions and we have two odd functions. And based on how they're odd or even, well, let me scratch that point right there. We'll move on. Let's look at an example of how this helps us learn a little bit more about some of these circles and trigonometric functions. We want to find the exact value of these measurements that we have right here. So the cosine of 45 degrees we know is an even function. So the cosine of a negative 45 degrees equals the cosine of a positive 45 degrees because it's an even function. And the cosine of 45 degrees is one of those values that we remember, or that we see an awful lot, is root 2 over 2. So what's the cosine of negative 45 degrees? Is root 2 over 2, because cosine is an even function, and I know what the positive value, I know what the cosine of 45 degrees is. And let's look at another value that I already started working on a little bit. So I have the tangent of negative pi thirds. We know that it's an odd function, right? If it's an odd function, then I know it becomes the negative of the tangent of pi thirds. You all right with that? We have our even and we have our odd functions. So what was the tangent of pi thirds? One of those values that we are familiar with, it was root 3. And there's a negative in front of it. So the value or the computation of the tangent of negative pi thirds is an odd function, which allows me to find out the tangent of pi thirds. That I know, which is root 3. Then the negative, because it's an odd function, it's a negative value of root 3.